Hi, I'm here with Charlie Deist, who's a regular part of the Way of Beauty podcast. Great to see you again, Charlie.
Hey, David.
And as you can see, if you're watching, uh, Charlie isn't in the courtyard at St. Jerome's with me. We're right in the middle of the lockdown, the in place. It's called shelter in place. Um, And what sparked this off is I just received a very interesting mailing. I'm on Charlie's mailing list, and it was about his personal response to what's going on. Some of the themes that we've talked about in the past, but what I thought was particularly interesting was Charlie's description of how that this is likely that what we're facing is likely to institute changes right the way up to government. I think that everybody's having to get to do things they haven't done before, and the tendency might be for the growth of government, the growth of big business at the expense of the small players. And what Charlie is describing this, you have a background in economics, Charlie, so you know what you're talking about there, I think. But
Well, I don't know
really,
about that, but
well, you know more than me. Let's put it like that, and you impress me. So I would say that what you say makes sense. The same sort of things actually had occurred to me. Honest, I want to make that point, but that isn't the main thrust of what you're describing. As I read it, you're talking about, even if that is the worst case scenario, that we come out of this very badly. In terms of centralization, more centralization, there are personal responses that we can make that counter that at a local level and involve us establishing communities. And first of all, I thought many of the things you said were great ideas, so we'll talk about those. But also, what occurred to me is that they're all in harmony with the spiritual life and the Christian life. And so they could be the sort of things that a parish could organise that would be very different from the sort of thing parishes normally do, and might help to build up community with the spiritual life and the liturgy as at the core of this, at the heart of this. But they could be done. And furthermore, you don't need lots of facilities. It's about organising people to do things together. So Charlie, first of all, I just like to hear your reaction to my summary and tell me if it's fair, and then just allow you just to talk a little bit about your ideas and where they think that how they might develop in the next 2, 3, 4 months, for example.
sure. The kinds of questions people are asking, I think, center around what is the government going to do next? What will be the response? What will this return to normal look like, or will we ever return to normal? And I think that that's kind of the wrong question, in that where we go ultimately isn't the decision of the federal government. To some extent, it will be the states and local governments, but mostly it's communities, families, and individuals who are going to decide how they go out and spend their time, spend their money. And there are certain trends that we can see are maybe being forced or guided by the larger powers that be. And I think that on the whole, some of these, whether they're effective or not, they do speak to a fragility that we've had for a lot longer, and that the coronavirus epidemic has only revealed to us in starker terms. So, for example, the tendency of centralization, and especially with respect to our food supplies. Congressman Thomas Massey from Kentucky is pointing out that we might have food shortages of a particular kind. It's sorry to disappoint all the bacon and pork lovers out there, but turns out that we really only have a few meatpacking plants in the country, and those are being affected by the shutdown. And so we might see shortages of those things at the grocery store. Now, luckily, as you know, David, because I keep some of my quarter cows in the deep freezer there at the convent where you live, I get my meat from
Yeah.
a local source, a rancher up in Santa Rosa, who has a few hundred head of cattle, and she sells sort of wholesale, but also smaller cuts. So this is just one way that we can decentralize our own personal economy, make it more robust and resilient to what I see as a growing sort of centralization that has a little bit to do with government, but it's also just the way of least resistance in a sense. You
Yeah,
have to actually otherwise go out and look for it.
yeah, I love this point. I'm less concerned about the food than you. I'm not thinking about it so deep. But what really interests me in this is the effect that these huge food producers have had on the landscape. As someone who loves the beauty of a rural environment and just likes to be in it, I'm not particularly interested in farming it, but I like to see it farmed beautifully. And these big producers that you described don't do that. And I'm not sure they produce the best food. People like you tell me that that's the case, and that actually there is a way to change that for all the subsidies and the fact that these producers are connected to government so directly in many ways. Through subsidization packages. There's a lot of politics involved. I don't know the details, but I know that much, that we can change the demand if we wish, and ultimately that will change things. So that, incidentally, you refer to the lady who gave you the beef, and she's a rancher called Heather, you say.
Right.
Do you know how she's doing at the moment, by the way? Is she selling food still?
She is, and she's had her usual kind of, she no longer does farmers markets, but she sells out of a space on her ranch. And I think that they were, decontaminating all of the plastic wrapped cuts of meat before handing them out. And they had the safety procedures, but I think that she's doing all right. And I don't know that business is necessarily booming, just because I think people still, by and large, are opting for the convenience of the grocery store. And certainly I wouldn't find it worthwhile to drive all the way up to Santa Rosa. It's about an hour and a half drive, depending on traffic, to get just a few cuts of meat. But when it comes to buying in bulk, or if you could set up these checkpoints or places within the urban areas where people can pick these up. And this model does already exist to some extent with community supported agriculture. You can look up CSAs in your area for both produce and meat, and it's marked up a little bit, but I think that this is a good opportunity for groups of people, clusters of families and friends who say, hey, this makes sense, I'll make the run. I'm going to get a quarter of a cow, that's something like 250 pounds, and that'll last our community for the next 2 or 3 months. And we can divvy it up, get a variety of cuts. It's grass-fed instead of grain-fed, so think of the sort of the granaries of Pharaoh's Egypt, which become kind of contaminated with toxic mold as they lay in these grain silos for long periods of time. This is actually, you can look this up, that there are toxic molds. We don't even know all the different kinds, but they form in the production line of the grains that make up the basis of the modern food pyramid. And so grass-fed beef, one, it sort of circumvents this problem of toxic mold, and it also is just a more natural diet for the cows themselves and leads to a healthier cut of meat, higher in omega-3s, which is sort of the ratio of, I won't get too deep into the weeds, but basically you want a higher ratio of omega-3 to omega-6. Otherwise, you can get some more inflammation if your diet is too heavy in omega-6s. But to go back to just the point of kind of the land and how the beauty of the land is a mirror in a way of the health of the food supply. I think that you can also point to just the whole sort of monocrop, monoculture production system being one it's more fragile, meaning if you have some sort of pest that is particularly problematic in one year, it can wipe out the entire crop, versus if you're planting many different kinds of crops, it also tends to erode the soils more quickly. And so we're incurring all of these invisible costs that only show up in a time of the kind of tail end of the probability curve, something like a coronavirus, but in agriculture. So I think that, again, this just reveals existing fractures, making them more obvious, but we'll see other ones in time. This is not going to be the only big event.
And I think a point here, and again, I'm open to correction from you, is that it takes a lot of work between government and these big suppliers to maintain themselves. Basically, they need regulation and law to cut out these small producers. And if you let things just happen and people choose what they wanted, you're much more likely to get the sort of things you're describing happening.
Right. It's called regulatory capture.
Okay, good. There's even a word for it.
Yeah, the big firms get together and write the legislation, and it puts out the smaller competition and sort of ensures a corner on the market. But in the case of meat production, I think it's interesting that the bottleneck comes from the meat packing plants and the slaughterhouses. So here in Northern California, we I think have maybe one remaining slaughterhouse, and all of the local organic and grass-fed producers have to go through that one. So this is actually one of the constraints, and it's not necessarily a pretty business, and I certainly wouldn't want to be the one to spearhead the next slaughterhouse. But I do think that when you lean too much on a regulatory framework, you get a bunch of big players that have the budgets to be able to comply with a lot of regulations that might not even ultimately contribute all that much to the health and safety and how humanely the animals are slaughtered. You just have the sort of economies of scale that allow it to be done with all of the boxes being checked.
And for the where does sort of Catholic social teaching come in? Is there any reference to this? Well, what occurs to me is that really the principle of subsidiarity is important. That you certainly at a political level, you want the power pushed down to the local level as far as possible. And one of the things about the economic system that's called distributism that I do like is that they propose that that's a good thing as well. You want as much locally based business and in terms of agriculture, locally based produce as possible. And it seems that the question that people disagree on is how do you achieve that? And broadly speaking, it seems to me the answer is stop preventing it happen. That it would actually happen naturally if you just let it. You don't need to have laws enforcing subsidiarity. You just need to remove the laws that stop it happening anyway. Is that fair, do you think?
Right. And of course, it's easier said than done in a way.
Yeah.
We have to consider politics within this framework of, I like the public choice frame around James Buchanan, one of the pioneers of public choice theory, calls it politics without romance. So we might think that we can create policy within a vacuum or basically just project all of our ideals onto the preferred policies that we'd like to see without considering how all of the various economic actors, which include people in government, these are the sort of public component of public choice, face the same incentives as people in a marketplace with respect to protecting their reputation, growing the budget and the bottom line for their agency. So you do have a sort of gravity at work, an economic gravity that is centralizing power in the hands of the agencies in concert with the big business. So Hilaire Belloc didn't have access to all of the insights of public choice, but I think that as a leading distributist, he still kind of intuited that we end up with an unstable equilibrium in a capitalist system. And I'm not against capitalism, and I think that the market rightly construed, or the free economy rightly construed, is the direction that we need to move. But the Hilaire Belloc's point was that capitalism is an unsustainable equilibrium. It tends to tip in the direction of capture by cronyism, or in the other direction of a sort of socialism.
Yes, and it takes the firm hand of government in a way to not to succumb to that temptation. That it needs strong figures who know how to restrain it, and that is the weakness of our arguments, that there aren't many of those figures around. But so.
That's actually an interesting point, and I've tended to think of a Republican form of government, not as in the political party, but the idea of the representative democracy, where you don't necessarily need any strong figurehead. But I do think that this is an area where I've evolved a little bit toward thinking that there is a balance, and to be able to have a strong enough government that you can restrain I don't want to call it the excesses, because that's just a cliche, but to restrain the underlying dynamics of crony capitalism. That's interesting. I would like to explore that. I mean, do you think that this is played out at any times or places where we can say that's a good model for?
Well, I think I don't know. I tend to work in idealistic form, but that I am the way that I characterize what you're describing is that I do see a role for government, and there's very few who'd say we shouldn't have any government at all. But I do see an active role in regulating to protect personal freedom, which is what I think I'm describing. And that means, therefore, that sometimes it does need positive law in order to protect individual rights. Now, that can go way wrong. We've seen how the language of human rights can distort things hugely. But I think it needs that, and what it needs is really a deep understanding of human nature and what human freedom is. And then you've got a chance. But it's not something that you can just eliminate. You can't just eliminate government and then expect things to develop. There's a vital role here, and government can be done well or badly. But
I agree. I think that especially among libertarians, you tend to have a lot of hand-waving about the spontaneous order, but politics is kind of nested within that spontaneous order, and there isn't a layer of human decision-making. There's a writer who writes a lot about the administrative state named John Marini, and he talks about there being a kind of unmanly contempt for politics among mostly, I think, conservatives and libertarians, people who follow H.L. Mencken sort of mindset of this utter contempt for politicians in all forms, that the politician is the scum of the earth. But I think in previous times there was an idea of statesmanship as a very noble pursuit, and that might be something worth recovering. And I don't really write about that in my article on the COVID-19 reset, because I'm mostly focused on how we can have just purely bottom-up solutions from our community. But I do think that the task for statesmen is to figure out, where can we apply discretion and judiciously write the laws to create institutions and a framework for markets to produce the ideal level of competition.
That's right. I don't see governments providing the solution, but I do think that they have a very, very strong supportive role in the right situation, which allows, as you say, the markets and communities. It's more than just simply economics. It's about people doing what's right and good at a personal level in accordance with human freedom. And then you do see a spontaneous order. I think something emerges through the.
That's a lot of hand waving, David. No.
Yeah. Sorry about that.
No, it does. It does.
Yeah.
And when you have good laws and good lawmakers, I think Thomas Massey is a good example. He just introduced a bill that might be getting this imprecisely worded, but I think that it will allow meatpacking plants to sell sort of individual cuts directly to the consumer. There's some idea of rewriting the laws in order to eliminate some of the red tape and the bureaucracy, but he has to pass a law to do that. So sometimes you can use the law to cut through that thicket of.
Yeah, especially in the American system, where if laws are passed, it seems to happen so rarely because you need all these different aspects of the American government system to come into agreement, and which is different from the British system, which I'm used to. Laws can be passed and reversed and much more easily. It's less frustrating for the politicians, but in the American system, you could introduce laws which protect things, and they're less likely to be reversed. Now that works well with the same applies to bad laws as good laws, but it's down. That's you just have to work within the political system. But I think that there are possibilities there. I'm hoping that what's going on at the moment is that they're planning that there is an end game to this situation. Somebody's got some idea of what the criteria are that dictate when we come out of it, and they've got some idea of how we come out of it. There's not much talk about that, and that's what's worried me right from the beginning when we go into it, to be honest. I always worried about situations where you go in without clearly defined criteria as to when you decide to come out. But I'm hopeful that maybe, given some of the tendencies of the current administration, perhaps they're preparing in some way to allow that to happen. They're using this as an opportunity. We'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, I think you're right about needing to be clear about some sort of benchmarks that we'll know when we hit them, just that we don't have this indefinite dragging on. And businesses need to form their plans based on expectations, and that's another concept from economics of the last 50 years or so, where we've discovered just how key those expectations are. And if you have regulatory uncertainty, then it creates this whole milieu of, well, I don't want to invest because I'm going to wait and see. And I think that this administration has been good in terms of being very clear about what the regulations are, and that even if you have regulation, it allows for investment based around something that will be the law for some time to come. But on that same sort of thread of the not the regulatory uncertainty, I wanted to go back to the article that I wrote where I talked about. I'm losing my train of thought. Maybe you can jump in.
I'm wondering whether we've probably reached an end on this topic, which wasn't one we planned to go down at the beginning anyway. Although I'm really interested by what you had to say there. Why don't we go back to some more of these personal responses to the current situation? So, one was we began the last train of discussion with consideration of where you buy your meat from and where you buy your food from. But you talk about responses involving just exercise, another great interest of yours, and how this might be an opportunity for people to get out and form community. I'm sensing, even in the current environment, this is the way that I mean, where can you meet people? It's only outside at the moment. You have, and obviously 6 feet apart, but that's what I'm doing. I'm going for walks and I'm meeting people at the trailhead and going walking, and that's the social activity at the moment. So perhaps can you speak to that a little bit, and especially with your sort of natural movement interests and how the ideas you've had there.
Yeah, I spend a lot of time at parks and outdoors where I do my natural movement practice, which involves imitating in some ways the movements of primitive humans. It was developed as a way to encapsulate the fitness that was observed on different islands where the people had been relatively untouched by civilization. But in spite of that, you might think that they would be, that our modernity would give us the tools to become more fit. But in fact, we see that people are using the comfort of modern life as an excuse not to move. So we've lost this physical culture that is embedded in every pre-modern society. And natural movement is one way to reclaim it, but it's by no means the only way. You can, of course, go to any number of gyms, not right now, but I think that the advantage of natural movement, one is that it's sort of general and holistic. It doesn't focus on these isolated exercises. Two, it takes place mostly outdoors, and so you get the added benefits of sunlight, vitamin D, the fresh air, the open air factor, which we don't know exactly what this is, but during the Spanish flu epidemic, it was noted that patients who were the sort of overflow from the hospital and had to be put on cots outdoors tended to recover faster than the people indoors. So there are all these benefits of being closer to the elements. Many elements also function as what I refer to as hormetic stressors. This is a theme from my newsletter with a natural method, that the right dose of a given stress can be healthy, whereas too high of a dose or no dose at all is unhealthy or even fatal. So you can run through sunlight. Too much of it, you might get skin cancer. Not enough, and you develop all kinds of problems. It interferes with your sleep. Cold water, too much, you get hypothermia. But if you never expose yourself to cold water, then you end up being a more sort of fragile and less resilient with respect to heat and cold. So in all these areas, nature, it's as if we're designed to live close to nature. Can you imagine such a crazy thing? But I've seen more people out at the parks in this period than I have in the previous years. So that's promising. Yesterday, there were even some kids that were swimming in the spot where I almost never see people go swimming. And so very heartening.
Now here's the thing that occurred to me when I've been talking to a priest, Father John, who we both know. I won't give his second name at the moment, but we've been talking about how we can regenerate parish life and what's occurred to us in our discussions, and this just began as idle conversation in a way, was that he would point out places. Now, I think in San Francisco it's called something like the Sanctuary, but it's people are familiar with these places. So they are subscription businesses. Their market is largely women with children. So they're people who are at home and quite well-to-do. Clearly, I mean, there's a subscription. Very nice-looking place where there is a creche. But then they offer things like exercise, yoga, meditation, a spa, all sorts of a cafe which offers a lot of sort of health food and vegetarian food, a very nice coffee shop, lots of meditation. I don't know if I mentioned that. And really, you don't need a very plush premises in order to do those things, and we can do them in accord with the Christian life. And it's something that a parish could organise. And what you're describing, for example, could take the place of the yoga and the exercise. We can offer meditation, Christian contemplative prayer. We can teach people about nutrition. When has that ever happened at a parish where for those who are interested, they can get involved in this sort of thing for the nourishment of body, soul, and spirit? And you don't need a lot of very expensive facilities. These are things that people can choose to do if they're given the freedom to do so and they know what to do. So, and I think that what you're describing, this is what jumped out at me at the newsletter you sent, that you're describing all the sort of activities that can be done in a Christian context, and you're attacking this idea that we have to have a gym or a very expensive club to join. These are things that people can choose to do very easily if they know what to do. So
yeah, I think the Latin phrase corruptio optimi pessimi is coming to mind. The corruption of the best is the worst, and I do think that the model of Christian community, in some ways, that example that you're describing, I don't want to knock on it too hard, because I do think that for some people that could be a really valuable missing component from their life. But I think that it does fall short of what community can and should be, and the sort of consumption model of community could be contrasted with the model of the parish that we've talked about, where it's really more about, what am I contributing to my community, and then centered around liturgy and the sort of worship that is due to God. Instead, it becomes this sort of self-centered cult of almost a fashion statement, or you belong to this school of meditation because it comes with the most fashionable leggings, and you become a vegetarian because all of your friends are doing it. And I also have nothing against vegetarianism, even though my diet skews towards healthy, happy animals and the products that they deliver. So I do think that we can model this extended parish life on. Maybe there are some lessons that can be learned, but I think that it's also important to focus on what would make them different. And I think one area is using existing spaces rather than creating a sort of posh new city center or gym and buying all the latest equipment and espresso machines. Instead, just using the freely available parks as a meeting place for potlucks. I opened my essay with a line from the book of Isaiah, which I think was read on Easter this year, which is, why do you spend on that which is not food? Why do you labor for that which does not nourish? Or something to this effect, where so much of where people are spending their money these days is on the non-essentials. And there's that word, again, that keeps coming up in the context of the quarantine and the lockdown is, essentials only. So when we're talking about, well, what's really essential? Is it the snacks from the center aisle of the grocery store? Is it going to the gym and spending $250 a month for a high-end subscription to a fitness program? Or is it really going out on walks with your family and close loved ones, people in your community? So I think that this is something that we should continue to do but broaden it out as we start to become, in my opinion, a little bit more sane about the relative risks. Start to, spend time after church at the park and make that a more ritualized thing.
Yes, actually, one of the things that at St. Elias, when it's the feast of the patron, they always eat after Divine Liturgy.
Mhm.
This is the church that I go to with Father Sebastian Carnazzo, so some of you will know, the scripture scholar, and so I've been going to his church. But the first time I went, it was the feast of Saint Elias, and so they always transfer that from the church hall, which is where they normally eat after the Divine Liturgy, and there's a rota of people organising that, which in itself is pretty good for a small parish community. But they always go out to the park and have a picnic on the feast day, and it's something that he organises. And I love this idea of just making use of ordinary facilities. Coming back to my old mentor, actually, David Birtwistle, so he was in his 60s when I met him, but he always used to laugh about all the equipment that people used to get and to do sports. And he was very much, in my day, he's one of those sort of people. But he just said all we used to do was put on a pair of white plimsolls and a pair of grey flannels did for everything. You played tennis in it, and basically you didn't think about the equipment. You just went out and did it, and it was very much. You didn't spend as much on doing these activities, and people did a lot more. He would talk about this right down to the at all levels of society. So people that in England, of course, there's a great tradition of going out and walking and exercising, going out into the farmland where there is a traditional right to go on public footpaths. But this really is made use of. A lot of people do it and enjoy it. It's not an extreme sport in which you get kitted up in the latest equipment and clothes. Everybody goes out and walks, and will happily walk 10 miles very often, just in an ordinary pair of comfortable shoes.
Right. This could be part of the whole reset, is a turn away from especially spectator sports in the big arenas, where we valorize the extreme talent, often at the expense of just more ordinary physical ability, and we sort of downplay our own inheritance as incredible movers, and that's everyone's endowment, or virtually everyone can get out and move in these ways. And even just some of the team sports that people play with all the equipment and all the hyper specialization, so many injuries come out of this. Whereas if you take a more, whether it's walking or in the practice that I have, again modeled after an older practice called La Méthode Naturelle, the natural method of Georges Hébert. He writes about this, that in his time, you had basically everyone had attempted to solve the problem of physical education, from people in sports to the military to journalism, but no one had really gotten a handle on it because they were approaching it from these specialized fields rather than from just a field of physical education. And so I think that there are some principles that need to be rediscovered and sort of relearned and taught in a pedagogical way. But most of us at least still have some memory of what it's like to move naturally. When we were kids, we played on the rocks and climbed trees and just moved our bodies in ways that were meant to, but no longer are required to, because of all the ways that things are just provided for us.
Mm. Yes, very interesting. Well, Charlie, we're about at an hour there, so I think there's many more things we could discuss. I'm going to post your newsletter on the Way of Beauty podcast page, so you can read that as well as you're listening to this and watching this now. I think that there's more material there that we could talk about. As usual, we branched off into areas that we hadn't anticipated. Very interestingly, I thought. Is there anything that you'd like to just finish with before we close?
I think the walking topic is one that we certainly could dedicate a whole episode to, and I'd like to. I think that on one of our podcasts, it was shortly before I did the 50-mile march around the three bridges of San Francisco Bay.
Oh,
and
yeah.
This is sort of inspired by two American presidents. The first was Teddy Roosevelt, who first issued this directive to his army officers, saying that basically, even in peacetime, you should be able to walk 50 miles spread out over 3 days. And he also required them to run the last mile and sprint the last 200 meters. JFK revived it in the 1960s. He wrote an essay for Sports Illustrated when he was president-elect, talking about the soft American, how we become softened. And that was basically Roosevelt's theme as well, that we need to restore a vigorous life, a strenuous life. And walking, even a couple of miles is a good way to get started, whatever level you're at. And I think that for me, I've found that doing the 50-mile march, I've done it once the full thing. I got stopped on my initial attempt after 40 miles because the Golden Gate Bridge was closed after 6:30. This time it turns out that they open it up until 9:30 during the spring and summertime. So we got there before we even had to. But I walked with Ben Brown, another mutual friend, and what I find is that walking is one of the most versatile movements. It can be picked apart and sort of improved in terms of your efficiency, but regardless of how you walk, it's good for you and makes you more resilient. The more you do it, the better, and it's very hard to walk so much that you hurt yourself. I think 50 miles you can come close, but anything short of 10, and most people are going to be okay. So if you want to learn more about the techniques for walking longer distances, I do have a guide, the sort of how to walk better, faster, stronger, lighter, and it's based on biomechanics and a little bit of the natural method techniques, plus some other modalities more recently developed by people like Esther Gokhale, who's an expert on posture and alignment. And she has a technique called glide walking that if you have never done it before, it'll change the way you walk. So you can get that if you sign up for my email list, or just email David or drop a line in the comments with your email address, and I'd be happy to send it to you.
Give us your website address again where people can go.
It's anaturalmethod.com. Okay. I'm not claiming that it's the natural method. There are many methods. I think it was Thoreau who said, of methods there are many, but of principles but few. And so this is just anaturalmethod.com. There's also some other guides there that are free PDFs for email subscribers, including the ever popular Poor Man's Paleo guide to shopping and eating on $10 or less. And butter is a-okay on the Poor Man's Paleo protocol. So.
For any diet. And the great thing about walking is that you can do that anywhere. You don't need a gym for this. And in California, we're blessed with particularly this part of California, with a climate which really is just meant for getting out and just enjoying being outside and the beautiful scenery that we have. Indeed. So Charlie, great to talk to you. Thanks once again.
Good to talk to you, David. See you in the garden, I hope, soon.
I hope so. Let's hope there's an end to this. God bless you and goodbye.
God bless.